Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about intercultural communications, which is extremely important no matter where you live or what you do. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Greg Storti, a returned Peace Corps volunteer, is an author and also a trainer and consultant in the field of intercultural communications and cross-cultural adaptation. 8 of his books are on intercultural topics, while 2 of the most recent are titled Why Travel Matters and The Hunt for Mount Everest. Greg Storti, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's just start on with one of your books, like Why Travel Matters. Why did you write it, and what's the thrust of it?
Well, for many years, I've been fascinated by all these travel books, mostly written by the early British travelers, but recently by a lot of famous travelers. And all the travel books, the travel narratives, they all make the same point, which is that travel changes you, which we all know. It broadens your horizons, it deepens your perspective, it opens up your mind, all these phrases that we're familiar with. I think it was Somerset Maugham who said, that you don't come back from travel the same person who left. And I thought to myself, that's very true. We all know it sort of experientially. But what actually are the mechanisms by which that happens? What happens that means that a person who comes back isn't the same person that left? So I'm in my intercultural field, I've thought about this kind of tangentially. But for this book, I wanted really to try to answer the question, what are the mechanisms by which travel accomplishes these great transformations that we're all aware of and that we all experience? And so that's why I wanted to write the book. And if you're interested in what the mechanisms are, I can talk about that a little bit.
Oh, we'll get into those shortly, I'm sure. Yes. I might mention too that your website is www.craigstorti.com, or if any of our viewers would like to go to that to get more information. You're talking about the motivation for travel, which I think travel is one of the greatest joys in life. And I noticed that you, as I was a returned Peace Corps volunteer, you were a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco. How did your experience in the Peace Corps shape your, I guess, your path, or put you on the path to international travel, international communication, and to sort of broaden your horizon, so to speak?
Yes. Well, it's funny. In the days when I applied, which was way back in 1970, you could specify where you'd like to go. There weren't any guarantees. And I didn't have a particular country in mind, but what I did put on my Peace Corps application was, and I think this was, I don't know how I knew this, but I wanted to make sure that I was sent to a non-Christian country. I thought if I was sent to a non-Christian country, then I'd be guaranteed that I would be in a very different place from where I grew up. And so it so happened that I was sent to Morocco, which was, of course, non-Christian. But even I think somewhere inside me was this idea that there's got to be a very different world out there. See if you can find it. And so my wish was answered. I was sent to a non-Christian country. And it just affirmed my suspicion that there are people who think completely differently, and yet they lead happy, successful lives too. So I want to see how this happens. And so, of course, living in a country, learning Arabic and teaching at a school, interacting all day in and day out with the local folks, I was exposed to different worldview, and yet I saw, well, that's not where I come from, but it works for them. Where I come from works for me. And I left Peace Corps realizing that there's alternative realities, alternative worldviews, and yours is one, and there are others that are completely legitimate and that work successfully. And I did a little bit of reading when I was in Morocco, but more I just sort of soaked up the experience. And when I came back from Morocco, Bill, that's when I started educating myself in the intercultural field. There's some academic texts, etc. But I first wanted to experience it, and then I thought, well, now I need to understand this. And so some of the giants in the intercultural field had written books by then, and I got interested in that, and I thought, well, maybe I can teach this stuff. And some guys at the University of Iowa were doing an ag extension program in Morocco, and they wanted somebody to tell them what it was going to be like for them in Morocco. And so they got a hold of me, and that was my first gig, as I call it. And I told them what I could about Morocco, and I just found opening people's eyes was so rewarding that I thought, gosh, if I can do this as a career, let's go for it. And of course, writing a couple books up front, that really helped give me some credibility, and then some clients started to find me. So that's how it all happened.
Yes. And of course, when John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, created the Peace Corps in 1961, it was designed to provide technical assistance to economically developing countries. The second goal was to share America with people in other parts of the world so they knew more about us. And the third was to bring the goal or the experience home as to what you had experienced and why it's applicable in your life and in other people's lives today. And you've certainly done that through this extensive writings of books. But let me ask you, what is the best way to learn about another culture? Obviously, joining the Peace Corps might be one way. Buying your books would be another way. But what do you suggest? Maybe two or three best ways to learn more about another culture.
Well, in a general sense, excuse me, and then I'll see specifics. Generally, spending time around somebody from another culture. Now, that can be in your own culture, where that person is a exchange student or maybe a recent immigrant, or it of course can be in another culture where you're the person. But basically experiencing another culture in whatever form. One form is just spending quality time befriending somebody from another culture. As you interact socially with that person, you begin to see a different worldview. I think probably when people often ask me, how do I get into your field? And I always tell them, you really need to have a significant overseas experience yourself. When clients hire me, one of the first things they want to know is, have I lived this? And because I have, I can say yes. And it gives you instant credibility, even if the client who's hiring you wants to know about Germany and you spent time in Morocco, they know you've been a foreigner. And one of the best ways to understand people from other cultures is to be the foreigner. And the only way you can really be the foreigner is if you're living in another culture. And it shows you what those people must feel like when they interact with you. So the shorter answer to your question is a significant experience either with somebody from another culture or ideally in another culture. And it doesn't have to be 2 years, Bill. It can be 6 months, as long as you're really grounded in the society and not sort of hanging out with other expatriates, which is always a risk for some people.
That's always a risk when you're overseas. You seek out English speakers, in our case, let's just say, and hang out with them more than with the local folks, which it's not bad to see the people who speak the same language, but still you need to acculturate yourself into their culture if you're going to learn much about it. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our show and you would like to share it, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a very important skill called intercultural communication. It's very important for all of us. My guest is really an expert on this topic. Greg Storti, a returned Peace Corps volunteer, is an author and also a trainer and consultant in the field of intercultural communications and cross-cultural adaptation. One of his most recent books is Why Travel Matters. Craig, we've heard for years, and it varies, I think, from period to period, but we've heard about the ugly, quote, ugly American, unquote. Do Americans, is it harder for us to learn more about other cultures? It's amazing when you go overseas how many people in other areas of the world know a lot about us in this country, especially the political situation. But is it harder for us to maybe open our minds or to feel comfortable in another culture and to reach out to people when we go overseas?
Well, I think historically it has been because we were sort of the number one country. What I said in one of my books is, in American business world, you didn't have to sell, you just had to manufacture. We were the only people making them. If you wanted to buy it from us, if you wanted to buy it, you bought it from us. And there was no need to reach out and try to understand the other clients. Because whether we understood them or not, we were still going to be successful. That's changed. I'm thinking of the business community now. Everybody's making it. The Chinese are making it quicker, faster, and cheaper. And in order to sell, which we never had to do before, we just had to make, you have to understand the customer, and you have to be able to sell their way and pitch the product the way that works for them. So I think historically we weren't so good at that. But maybe Bill, maybe you don't. The intercultural field actually began right after World War II, when a lot of Americans were stationed at army bases around the world. And for the first time, for most of them, they were living in another culture, interacting on a regular basis, of course, with their military colleagues, but also with the local culture. And that's where the demand for what became the intercultural field grew up. So we've been doing it since the late 40s. I do think there's still a sense that other people should figure us out. The need for us to figure them out isn't so great. But I'll tell you an interesting story. It's kind of why I put this question in the Zoom call today. I always thought that Europeans who live cheek by jowl, you can go 2 hours and be in Holland, you can go 3 hours and be in Spain. I always thought, they would be much better at this than we were. And actually what I found out, because I've done a lot of work with European companies, is they assume they know all this. They don't study it. They say, well, we go every weekend to another culture. We don't need to study them. And actually, I found in a way, they're much less aware because they think proximity creates understanding. Well, proximity just creates proximity. Understanding may come from that. You can use that as a way to reach understanding. And in fact, I've found, if it's not rude to say this, that they think that Americans just don't get it. And actually, when I interact with them and do webinars, they have as little or even less understanding as a lot of my American audience. And I think it's just a sense that, well, we see foreigners every day, so we must understand them, but that's not sufficient.
No, it's certainly not. Yes. Now, I mentioned about certain skills. What skills would you say? Is there a list when you're talking to people? Say, here are 10 things you need to keep in mind to learn more about another culture, or perhaps to be more receptive to learning a foreign language, or perhaps to travel to some area of the world where you might not feel quite as comfortable as if you go to Des Moines, Iowa, or something like that. But do you have a list of what skills would be helpful?
Well, interestingly enough, one of the activities I do in some of my training is I give a list of 11 skills that people in my field think are important for being effective across culture. And then I ask people to pick the one that they think the experts in the field picked as the most important. And everybody misses it, because what a lot of us in the field think is the most important is to actually be aware of your own culture. if you're going to be successful at working with people from other cultures, you need to understand how they're different from you. And that starts with understanding what your culture has taught you, because you can see, oh, we think this way, our friends in France think that way, so there's going to be some adjusting. And so one skill, to answer your question, is to try to become more aware of your own culture. And to that point, by the way, it's one of the first points I make in the book, Why Travel Matters, is that one of the biggest things you learn when you travel is you start to understand your own culture. When you're in your own culture, you don't see it, you just live it. When you go overseas and are exposed to all kinds of differences, that automatically it forces you to think about where you came from and your culture. And so one of the great benefits of travel is understanding your own culture, because at the end of the day, that means understanding yourself. And an individual is not exclusively his or her culture, but it's a large part of who each of us is. And if understanding the world and yourself is one of the greatest human pursuits, then understanding your own culture is a great gift for understanding yourself. And it's really hard to get a perspective on your own culture when you're inside it. And so, ironically, when you're overseas, you will of course learn a lot about the local culture. You'll come back with a much better understanding of yourself. Another tip, you asked for tips plural, would be to try to get comfortable with being outside your comfort zone, because it's really only when we encounter the unfamiliar that we start to learn. And if you're not comfortable outside your comfort zone, if the unfamiliar threatens you or frightens you, then you'll probably not benefit so much certainly from an overseas experience. So being able to get outside your own comfort zone and understanding your own culture as you go into interactions with people from other cultures, those are two really important skills for being what we sometimes call culturally competent.
They certainly are, no doubt about it. And I'm sure you've been bombarded with hundreds, maybe thousands of questions, excuse me, from people from overseas who'll ask you about certain, maybe so many of them will have stereotypes. I had a friend
Yes.
of mine in the Dominican Republic who was convinced we could drive from New York to California in 12 hours because the highways were so great. Well, the interstate highway system is pretty good, but you're not going to make it in 12 hours. It just isn't going to happen. So you will get hit with a lot of stereotypes, a lot of misinformation. And I guess another key was not to feel threatened when people ask you about this, or they accuse the United States or whatever, XYZ, whatever it might be, but
Yeah.
just to explain it to them objectively, rationally, not get too excited about it, just take it in stride, and then it'll all work out in the end. But sharing information is so critical, and it really promotes this communication and I think a more peaceful world. To be quite honest, as we've seen through programs like Sister Cities programs, through People to People program, of course, the Peace Corps outreach, just a variety of activities that are underway. Have you done any training at all with the Peace Corps or with some of these other groups that I've mentioned? I know you've got a long list of folks you've trained to promote their intercultural communication skills.
Well, yes. When I finished, well, I was a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years. Then I actually worked in the administration in Washington for 6 years, during which I met my wife. She's American, but she was Peace Corps staff in Nepal. And so I moved to Nepal. And then for several years, I directed what are called Peace Corps training programs. You know, they're usually three-part. There's culture, there's language, and there's technical skills. And so I directed, usually they last about 3 months. I directed Peace Corps training programs in Nepal, in Morocco, in Tunisia, and Sri Lanka. And it was one of the best jobs, I thought, in the Peace Corps, because at that stage, you get people who've just arrived. Some of them have never been outside the United States. And you get a chance to mold them early on and sort of give them the right attitudes and some good advice. And I really enjoyed that job. There are jobs with more responsibility and more authority and probably well, but I'm not sure there's any job with more influence than these trainers who confront these people at the very beginning and help to shape their attitudes. To a point you were saying earlier, I think in terms of making the world a better place, I think if you meet one foreigner in your life and get to know that person, it changes both you and that person for the better, because you grow from that experience. And as I say in the very last sentence of my book, Why Travel Matters, people who can grow are mankind's best hope. If you can't grow, then that's sad. But and travel teaches you how to grow, and you do grow from travel. And so there's hope for us as long as we can grow.
There certainly is, and you will learn more about another country, another culture, and more about your own country and your own culture. Well, we're just about out of time, but I looked at your list of companies and groups that you've provided cross-cultural training to, and not to go through all of them, but is there a certain strain like with Microsoft, the U.S. Department of State, the United Nations World Bank, and a university like Yale? Is there some strain of what they wanted, or were they all different types of communication? I mean, it's all intercultural, but you've got certain messages that you're packaging, so to speak, or you want to present to someone else in another part of the world.
Well, there's a couple of themes that run through my,
Themes, yeah.
no matter who I train. And the main theme is that behavior, what we experience when we deal with somebody else, is based on your values, your beliefs, and assumptions. And those things make your behavior make sense or not. When you're dealing with somebody from another culture, to some extent, they're going to have different values, beliefs, and assumptions. And so, of course, automatically, they're going to have different behaviors. And to be effective working with somebody across cultures, you need to see the ways in which they're different from you, so that their behavior ultimately makes sense. Now, it might not make any sense to you, but if you understand where people are coming from, regardless of what you think about where they're coming from, then their behavior makes sense. And my message always is, when people's behavior makes sense, no matter what you think of it, when their behavior makes sense, you can deal with anybody. It's only when people's behavior just seems completely random and illogical that it's very frustrating to deal with them. But if you can understand where they're coming from, that's what I mean by values, beliefs, and assumptions, then you can understand their behavior. And if you can understand people's behavior, no matter what you think of it, you can work with anybody. That's kind of a
Exactly.
theme that I use in
Exactly.
all my
True. Well, you've had decades of experience in this. You've encountered tens of thousands of people from many parts of the world. You've worked with a variety of companies. Do you have one or two fondest memories or lessons learned, or whatever you might want to say, over the years? That I'm sure that you've got dozens of them, I would imagine, but just two or three that really come to mind. We're down to about our last minute and a half. So
yeah.
naturally, the hardest question with no time left.
Well, one of my favorite stories, another Morocco Peace Corps volunteer told me the story. He was a teacher in this relatively rural village. It was a farming village, and it was the spring harvest. Sorry, it was the fall harvest, and everybody goes to the fields, and there's a foreman who tells everybody where their place is. And so my friend, the local English teacher, stands in line. He gets up to the foreman and he says, "And where's my place?" And the man says, "In the classroom." And he thought he was being a good guy, and he was, of course, being a good guy. But in some cultures, the position you occupy, you have to treat that with respect and well, effectively know your place. But I thought it was quite a good example of two different mentalities clashing with each other.
It certainly is, no doubt about it. Yes. Well, we all have a lot of memorable, well, remembrances from our experiences overseas. Some not as quite as memorable, to be quite honest. There are always bumps in the road. You have dips, and you're in the valley one day and you're on the mountain the next day. But it's extremely important to get out and to learn more about other people. And there are a variety of ways you can do it. You can do it through the Peace Corps. You can do it through some of the programs I mentioned. You can do it through service clubs like Rotary International. They have exchange
Mhm.
programs with the students coming to live with the family in the United States, and then someone in that family would go overseas and live with another family. So a variety of ways to do it. But Craig Storti, I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Well, thank you, Bill. My pleasure.
Okay, thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.